The Porsche 911 has been built in many generations, but one of the most interesting is the Type 964. Produced from 1989 to 1994, it sits in a special place in the 911 family. It keeps the classic shape and air-cooled engine, but adds modern technology like all-wheel drive and anti-lock brakes. Many enthusiasts see it as one of the last truly analog versions of the 911. To understand the 964, we first need a little context. By the late 1980s, the original air-cooled 911 design was already more than 25 years old. Emissions rules were getting stricter. Buyers were asking for more comfort and safety. Competitors from Japan and other European brands were releasing fast, refined sports cars. Porsche needed to update the 911 without losing its identity. The result was the Type 964. At first glance, it still looks like a classic 911. The basic silhouette remains the same. It has the familiar round headlights, rear engine layout, and compact 2+2 body. But if you look more closely, you can see the differences. The bumpers are now fully integrated and painted in body color. The car sits slightly lower and cleaner. A small rear spoiler rises automatically at speed and disappears when the car slows down. These changes improved aerodynamics and gave the car a more modern appearance. Under the skin, the 964 is much more different than it looks. Porsche claimed that more than 80% of its parts were new. The engine is still an air-cooled flat-six, but it gains more displacement and more technology. Most 964 cars have a 3.6-liter engine with twin spark ignition and improved fuel injection. Power is around 247 horsepower in the early Carrera 2 and Carrera 4 models, with smooth torque delivery and a strong pull all the way to higher revs. One of the biggest changes is the introduction of all-wheel drive on the Carrera 4. Earlier 911 models sent all their power to the rear wheels. The Carrera 4 uses a complex system with a center differential to send torque to the front axle as well. The goal was to improve stability, especially in wet or snowy conditions. In practice, the all-wheel drive 964 feels more secure and less tricky at the limit than older purely rear-drive 911s. The chassis also receives a major update. The 964 replaces the old torsion bar suspension with coil springs and shock absorbers at all four corners. This gives engineers more control over ride and handling, and makes it easier for owners to tune the car. Power steering becomes standard on most models, making low-speed driving and parking easier, while still giving good feedback on twisty roads. Anti-lock brakes are introduced to improve safety under heavy braking. Inside the cabin, the 964 mixes old and new. The famous 5-round gauge cluster remains in front of the driver. The driving position is still very much classic 911, with a steeply angled steering wheel and upright seating. But equipment levels are higher. Air conditioning, improved sound insulation, optional airbags, and better quality materials make the car more comfortable for long trips. The goal was to keep the emotional feel of a 911, but make it more livable as a daily driver. Porsche offered the 964 in several body styles. The Carrera 2 was rear-wheel drive. The Carrera 4 had all-wheel drive. Buyers could choose a coupe, a Targa with a removable roof panel, or a full Cabriolet. On top of the standard cars, there were special versions, such as the lightweight Carrera RS and the wide-bodied turbo models. The turbo at first used an updated version of the 3.3-liter engine from the previous generation, and later gained a more powerful 3.6-liter turbocharged engine with well over 300 horsepower. From a driving perspective, the 964 occupies a middle ground between classic and modern. Compared with older 911s, it feels more planted, more refined, and less nervous at the limit. The car is still rear-engined and will still reward smooth, skilled driving, but it no longer has the same reputation for snap oversteer that earlier cars had. At the same time, it does not isolate the driver the way some newer cars do. The steering, brakes, and suspension still communicate clearly. There are no large digital screens or heavy driver aids. This balance is one reason why many people call the 964 one of the last truly analog 911s. Now let us talk about the collector market. For many years, the 964 sat in the shadow of earlier classic cars and later water-cooled 911s. Prices were relatively low, and many were used as everyday sports cars. Over the last decade, however, interest has grown quickly. Several trends helped push values higher. First, the general rise of air-cooled 911 prices pulled the 964 upwards. Second, companies such as Singer Vehicle Design began using the 964 as a base for high-end restomod builds, which drew a lot of attention to the chassis. Third, enthusiasts started to appreciate the car's unique position between old and new. Today, a good 964 is no longer cheap. Prices vary a lot depending on model, condition, and history. A usable Carrera 2 coupe with higher mileage and some cosmetic wear might start in the $50,000 to $60,000 range. Well-kept, low-mileage cars easily move into the $80,000 to $100,000 range and beyond. Special versions, such as the Carrera RS Turbo models or cars with rare colors and options, can go much higher. If you are thinking about buying a 964, there are several key areas to inspect. First, as with any older 911, engine condition is critical. These flat-six engines are strong, but they can suffer from oil leaks, worn valve guides, or issues with head-to-cylinder sealing. A proper engine rebuild by a specialist is expensive, so it is important to look for documentation and service history. Second, you should pay attention to the all-wheel drive system on a Carrera 4. If the system has not been maintained correctly, repairs can be complicated and costly. Some buyers prefer the simpler rear-drive Carrera 2 for this reason. Third, check the suspension bushings and steering components. A tired 964 will feel loose and vague, but with fresh parts it can drive tightly and precisely. Rust is less of a problem than on much older classic cars because the 964 was built with better corrosion protection. However, you should still inspect the usual spots such as the front trunk area, the base of the windshield, and the lower sections of the doors and wheel arches, especially on cars that have lived in wet or salty climates. Electronics are another consideration. The 964 has more wiring, control units, and sensors than earlier 911s, but it is still much simpler than modern cars. Issues with aging control units, window mechanisms, or instrument clusters can appear, but specialist support is widely available. For many enthusiasts, the 964 has become a sweet spot in the 911 story. It offers the classic air-cooled sound, analog feel, and iconic shape, but adds just enough comfort and safety to be usable on modern roads. It is old enough to feel special, but new enough that you can still take it on a long highway trip without stress. In summary, the Porsche 911 Type 964 is more than just a bridge between generations. It represents a careful balancing act between tradition and innovation. It preserved the character that made the 911 famous, while quietly introducing the technologies that would carry the model into the 21st century. For collectors and drivers who want an air-cooled 911 that they can truly drive and enjoy, the 964 remains one of the most appealing choices. In the next episode, we will stay in Europe, but move to something very different in character, and look at an Italian classic that combines design, sound, and drama in its own unique way.